Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. Today I will be ranking all of the NPC builds that appear across the Shadow Realm. I will be using their armor, weapons, spells, and anything else that makes up each of their kits. Then, depending on how good I think their build is, I will rank them 1 through 12. Now before we start, I want to share a couple of disclaimers. First, this list is just my opinion, so if you disagree, that's cool and I hope to see your take in the comments. Second, I will be using whatever talismans and crystal tiers I think work best with each build, as the NPCs do not really have a way of telling me theirs. So, if you want to see a more in-depth build guide on a specific weapon, let me know and I'll try to make a video in the future. Third, I will not be using any consumable items that the NPCs may use, besides 2 exceptions, and I will go into detail on those when they come up. Lastly, in order to discover the weapons, spells, and items certain NPCs use, I had to watch them fight, and so I may have missed 1 or 2 on some builds, as I just never saw them being used. Despite this, I don't think they would have any impact on the ranking I created, so with that, thank you for your patience, and let's get into the list. To start at dead last, we have Moore's build. I'm sure many of you who have fought him expected this. The dude has a big shield and nothing else. His unique skill on his shield is a bash that just knocks down smaller enemies. Now, I will give credit where credit is due, and this build's strongest attribute is its tankiness. I'm talking an equipment load of over 90. But we still have the problem of damage. This is where the first item exception comes into place, and that is the hefty rot pot. This is Moore's main way of damaging, and so I found myself just chucking 2 rot pots and waiting and dodging until the rot wore off. Rinse and repeat. You would need a lot of pots for any boss, and the fight would also last forever as it is your only damaging source. So it should be clear by now why this build takes last place. Next up we have Egon's build. While his voice lines certainly frighten his opponents, his great bow definitely does not. This is his primary weapon, and it's obvious and sad, but yeah, great bows are not a top tier weapon type, especially as a primary option. His skill, Egon's Drake Hunt, can boost his next shot, but besides fulfilling the role of picking enemies off from afar, it is entirely useless in boss fights. A small redeeming factor of his kit is his access to both Greyrol's Roar and Dragon Claw. Greyrol's Roar is good for debuffing your enemies and can be a good opener to boss fights. Dragon Claw is also good as it has very high hyper armor and can output some good stance and regular damage. At the end of the day, this build just really lacks a quick, reliable damage option, so it really struggles in the DLC as it is very rare an enemy or boss will give you enough time to get off a Dragon Claw. Count Ymir's build suffers from the same fate of lacking options. I only ever saw him use 3 spells, and so being a sorcerer only build, it has some big weaknesses. The first spell is Miriam's Vanishing. This teleports the user a short distance and gives them iframes. It does have one use over just dodge rolling, and that is you can start the cast animation of another spell before the reappearing. This means if you get used to it, you can get off some pretty consistent dodges and setups for your spells. The ranged option he uses is Glintstone Nails. This is a good spell that can get great damage and really good stance damage, but while its tracking is good for some fights, it can often miss in others and really depends on how the enemy moves. It is a good option, but ideally this build would have access to another, more consistent ranged option like Night Comet. The last spell is your only close range one, and it is Cherishing Fingers. Good damage and can block projectiles for a second if timed right. Not that great for the last spell though. As you can see, this build just has 2 attacks, and both are just decent, and neither is a fast cast. This causes the build to really struggle with faster enemies, and just having one fast sorcery option would have made this build go much higher, but sadly this is what we're stuck with. The Dragon Priestess has a pretty solid kit, but is just a little too unoptimized to be higher on the list. It is also the only other build that uses a consumable item, as using the Dragon Priestess Heart is the only way to transform into her. Her primary weapon is the Flowerstone Gavel. This is a hammer that has pure physical damage and is reliable as a main weapon. Nothing special, but nothing to really complain about. Its unique skill is Flower Dragon Bolt. This strikes the enemy with a lightning bolt and also debuffs them to take more lightning damage. The problem with this is the only lightning damage you get out of this whole build is the skill itself. She gets no access to any lightning damaging incantations, and this definitely can hold the build back. Speaking of holding the build back, the Dragon Priestess Heart, the item that causes the transformation, buffs all Dragon Cult incantations, but I never saw her use any of them. The only incantations I saw her use were the Dragon Bolt of Florisax and Dragon Claw. The Dragon Bolt of Florisax is helpful as it increases damage negation, and since this build does not let you wear armor, that can really help. Dragon Claw is also a good option, like we discussed in the build before, but good build held back by the underutilized buffs it provides. Ansbach's build has some great options with his two main weapons, the Obsidian Lamenta and Ansbach's Longbow. The Obsidian Lamenta is a scythe that has passive bleed and a good Ash of War called Dynastic Sickle Play. It is similar to the skill on Bloodhound's Fang, except it starts with the dodge and allows you to control how many hits you get after, depending on two follow-up options. It is nice having another iframe dodge in your kit, and the scythe gives good range. However, scythes are not the best. If you want range, typically spears are the way to go, and if you want speed, then go for katanas or curved swords. His other main weapon is his bow. It has the same moveset as short bows, allowing it to get quick attacks after dashing, rolling, or jumping. Its skill, however, is where it shines. It shoots out a horizontal spread of 8 arrows, but hitting just one of them gives you the damage of all 8. This means it is a long-range, area-covering, and high-damaging skill. The only downside is it takes up 8 arrows each use, but that's why we have other options to support it. The last attack option this build has is the Furious Blade of Ansbach. This is an incantation that has a charged and uncharged flurry of attacks that do fire damage and cause blood loss. I have to say, while it is a super cool spell to look at, it is terrible in this build and has no place. It cannot stun, has terrible damage, and very lackluster blood loss buildup. There was not one scenario where I wanted to use it over the normal Scythe's moveset. It is nice to have the option, but it's certainly not the best one. What places this build so low, despite the pretty good weapons, is the other builds shown are just better. Any build from this point on may not be the best, but it's definitely viable. Alright, next up is Thalier. Honestly, I thought this build was going to be terrible, but it actually became one of my favorites to test out. He utilizes two weapons. First up is the Deadly Poison Perfume Bottle. I'm not here to waste your time, so just take my word when I say it is useless. Bad damage, terrible moveset, and its skill, Deadly Poison Spray, poisons you and sometimes your opponent. And this skill is only really useful when you pair it with the Poison Flower Blooms Twice Ash of War, which you don't have. So overall, just stay away from this one. The second weapon is the one that surprised me, and that is Thalier's Hidden Needle. This is a fist weapon doing solely pierce damage, the best damage type, and also having passive sleep buildup. The skill, Sleep Evermore, is basically impaling thrust but helps proc Eternal Sleep, which is just a better sleep. I loved this weapon. It's fast, has a cool and simple skill, and deals respectable damage. Sleep is always nice to proc too, as even if the full sleep animation does not work on bosses, you will still get them to stagger with it multiple times a fight. Additionally, having access to the upgraded version of Sleep on your skill is a nice touch and can be used to close distance. This weapon definitely does have its weaknesses though. Biggest is range, and that's the case for all fist weapons, but unlike the Star Fist and Iron Ball, this weapon does not have the insane stance damage to make up for it. Also, Sleep is not the best passive ability to have, like I said. Bosses are, if not completely immune, will only stagger a little bit if Sleep is procced. The only exception to that is the Godskin Duo, in which you can put them each fully to sleep. Passives like Bleed and Frostbite would have made this weapon much better, but alas, these weaknesses are responsible for this build taking the number 7 slot. Jalan's build makes use of both the Sword and Shield of Night. Both are good for their classes, that being a katana and a small shield. The sword, similar to other katanas, also gets passive bleed. But what makes these weapons stand apart are their unique skills. First is Witching Hour Slash. This skill has a charged and uncharged version and unleashes a flurry of slashes. The fully charged version is obviously better as it unleashes more slashes and lunges farther, but I still found the uncharged version useful as it allows you to attack in the much more common short opening that most bosses have. The other unique skill that this build utilizes is Revenge of the Night, which is the Ash of War on our shield. This skill shoots out a black magic projectile that is normally very weak, but when used in the place of a guard counter, it gets about 3 times more damage and deals 15 stance damage. Since it is only a small shield, this skill is not that useful for many circumstances, as its defensive capabilities and guard boosts are not that high, so guard counters will be rare. There are two solutions to this problem though. The first is to just block projectiles, and that way you take minimal damage and stamina loss, but still get the damage boost, as it does not matter what attack hits the shield, only that one does connect. The other solution is to use the deflecting hard tier, as you will lose almost no stamina and block physical damage as long as you time the blocks right. Both of these options make sure that you can use this skill as an effective projectile throughout the fight. As far as the limits go for this build, I would say its overall damage can be lacking, and it does sometimes struggle with range as its projectile is reliant on getting hit first, and the sword's moveset and skill, unless charged, do not provide any range either. Freya's build is just an overall solid pick. She has decent armor, a curved greatsword, and a medium shield. Her curved greatsword has good total AR if you go with the heavy affinity, and also has a passive effect of boosting any red main battle skills on the sword. The one she uses is Savage Lion's Claw. It is the same as base Lion's Claw skill, except allows for an additional input to add 2 more slashes after the initial slam. I generally prefer the base Lion's Claw, as I like the increased damage and stance damage of the first hit, as it is very rare you will get all 3 off before you get hit. It is not a huge deal if you get hit while attacking, as it has such high hyper armor that you will almost never get stunned out of it. Freya also has access to a unique medium shield called the Golden Lion Shield. It is a good defensive option if you see yourself needing a shield, as it has 100% physical damage negation, and its skill, Roaring Bash, is good for dealing with lots of enemies, as it staggers them and can even knock down smaller ones. Like I said before, solid pick, just the ones ahead are better and just either cover more options, outdamage it, or even both. Ornstein's build is by far the simplest one on this list. It is just his armor and his weapon, the Falx. Luckily for him, the Falx is an extremely good weapon and single-handedly brought this build as high as it is. This is a paired curved sword, and as you probably know, curved swords have the best power stance moveset in the game, as all of the attacks hit at the same time, so you're really using the weapons the most effectively, and the damage just begins to rack up to insane levels. Oh, and did I mention this sword gets passive bleed? Yeah, the weapon that hits 1,000 times with each power stance combo gets passive bleed, so you better believe you'll be proccing that a ton throughout fights. Now honestly, this build would probably still be high even without the skill, but with the skill, it can shred as long as you are given ample time to do so. Its skill is called Revenger's Blade. It consists of a dash forward that can cover a ton of distance if held, and then a quick slash. This is good for closing in on enemies and starting aggro. Then, if you choose to input a heavy attack after that, you will unleash a flurry of attacks that can just give plain stupid amounts of damage. The downside of this skill I found is that unless you can get off the whole thing, I often found myself just using the regular power stance moveset, as it just outputs more damage and procs bleed more often. It is only if you get the full skill off you will seriously benefit. Very good dexterity build despite only having one weapon available. At number 3, we have a build I certainly did not expect to be this high, and that is Fire Knight Queeling. He utilizes his own greatsword for his main weapon, but funny enough, it is called Queeling's greatsword, but looks like a spear and is actually a heavy thrusting sword. This means it gets a good set of moves and does pierce damage, the best damage type, with most of these moves. The skill he has on this weapon is Flame Skewer, and it lunges forward while coating the blade in Mesmer's flame and buffing it for a short duration after. You also have the option for a follow-up heavy attack that throws additional flames. This is a good distance closer and will also throw smaller enemies into the air. He also has access to one incantation, that being Fire Serpent. This is one of the best spells to come out of the DLC and has good damage and amazing tracking. It adds range to this build and makes keeping up the pressure in boss fights super easy. Good damage, good weapon, and covers all the options. Certainly deserving of top 3. The runner-up slot goes to Letta. She is mostly carried by her sword, as it being a light greatsword, it is gifted with an amazing moveset and super solid options. Its skill, Needle Piercer, does quick damage and has very good tracking and range. It is fast enough to allow you to use it in between bosses' strings and definitely makes a difference in the long run. Additionally, Letta wears an armor set that provides an above average defensive showing compared to the lighter armor that the rest of the NPCs typically prefer. Lastly, she uses one incantation, and that is Multi-Layered Ring of Light. It is a solid area denial option when fully charged, as it can linger for a good amount of time and also increases in size. Definitely not a spell I found super useful, as I typically prefer Needle Piercer as a ranged option, but it does have its uses from time to time and it is always nice to have. Great damage, great moveset, good ranged option, and armor to top it off. Basically the complete package, and only outdone by one other. Now for the number 1 spot. Dryleaf Dane has a phenomenal kit available to him. He has both martial arts weapons, allowing him a solid moveset, but also 2 Ashes of War. The first is Palm Blast, and this thing is chargeable, does amazing damage, amazing stance damage, and has the hyper armor of a truck. The second skill is Dryleaf Whirlwind. This is a great move for stun-locking smaller enemies or proccing the many successive hit talismans. It is quick, good damage, and looks stylish as hell. If that was not enough, he also has access to the Discus of Light incantation, providing him a super reliable projectile when needed. But still, that is not all. He also is the only NPC with access to Golden Bow, so he can also buff himself before each fight. This build honestly seems like a fully fleshed out player kit, as it has everything you would need, and that makes it the best NPC build in all of the Shadow Realm. Alright everyone, that wraps up the video for today, and I really hope you enjoyed it. Again, let me know if you want to see any in-depth build guides on any of the weapons, or if you found a spell or weapon I missed when making these NPC builds. With that, I hope you have a great rest of the day, like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and until next time.